Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the City Club Forum. My name is Herb Kamm. I'm president of the City Club. Our speaker this afternoon is Nicholas J. Bush, who is president of the National Gas Supply Association, which is a Washington-based organization representing 85 major and independent companies which produce 95% of the nation's natural gas supply. I'm happy to say that Mr. Bush is a native of Lakewood who graduated from St. Ignatius High School and from John Carroll University and did graduate work at Case Western Reserve University. He further holds the distinction of having worked his way through grade school, to use his own description, by delivering the Cleveland Press. Mr. Bush has had a varied career. He was vice president of Mid-Continent Oil and Gas Association before taking over his present position. And prior to joining Mid-Continent, he was with the Exxon Corporation as its Washington representative, and before that, he was with Exxon in Houston. I'm sure we're all aware of the fact that the supply of natural gas and the price of natural gas is a vital question before the American people today. And in that spirit, I'm happy to introduce to you Nicholas J. Bush, the president of the Natural Gas Supply Association. Mr. Bush.
Thank you, Herb. I feel at home already. This is my first opportunity to address an audience as president of the Natural Gas Supply Association. Some would say that it shows no little personal courage to choose Cleveland in the midst of winter as your first forum to speak on behalf of natural gas decontrol. Others, however, who know me well, might say that it fits my prior business experience to a T. I left a pleasant, enjoyable life here in Cleveland 12 years ago, attracted at the time by the bright lights and excitement of the automobile business. Much to my surprise, about the time I arrived in Detroit, the torrid American love affair with the car had begun to cool noticeably. You can imagine my exhilaration when I was given an opportunity to join the booming world of energy. Unfortunately, however, the joy was somewhat short-lived. The weather in Houston was definitely sunnier, but the climate for oil companies was a bit hotter than I would have liked. At one point, it seemed like oil companies were being accused of everything short of precipitating World War III. It was with no little apprehension, therefore, that I accepted Exxon's offer of becoming a Washington representative with responsibility for liaison in the Senate. Sure enough, not long after I arrived in Washington, Khomeini had arrived back in Iran, and an oil crisis was soon at hand. With crude oil and product allocation firmly in the hands of bureaucrats, it wasn't too long before we had the jet fuel in Bangor, Maine, the heating oil in Miami, and 2-hour-long gasoline lines at stations across the country. It was not a wonderful time to be in Washington. Armed with that personal information, you might understand why today's opportunity seems less formidable than it might otherwise. What's more, I've had a rare opportunity for a speaker. I have tried successfully, I hope, to pack the audience with family and friends. Cleveland is my hometown, and no one could have been more pleased to have read the recent New York Times story, Ivor Peterson's story, I believe, on Cleveland's resurgence. It sure beats the years of snide and unfair remarks that this fine city has had to absorb. So I don't believe that there could have been a better opportunity or a forum to deliver a message which may not be popular, but is one, I'll assure you, that could not be more important or timely. Overall, our nation and Ohio's energy situation is much better today than it was at the start of the 1980s. We are much less dependent on foreign oil today than we were just a few years ago. In fact, at the beginning of 1980, the United States was importing nearly half of its oil, 8 million barrels a day. Last year, that had been reduced to 5.6 million barrels a day. And now we have an opportunity to build on that progress, to work further toward genuine energy security. The opportunity lies with natural gas. Natural gas is one of our country's most abundant resources. There is more still to be found in this country than we've produced and used in our entire history. But natural gas suffers a fate guaranteed to a commodity that has been regulated for decades. And natural gas is the only primary U.S. energy fuel still under federal price controls. That limits the amount of gas available for consumers in Ohio and elsewhere. It invites future shortages. It makes it necessary for us to import more oil than we might otherwise, and it promotes waste of this premium clean-burning fuel. For all those reasons, it's time to remove the roadblocks of regulation and controls. And the majority of responsible economists, energy analysts, government officials, and in fact, even some traditional oil industry lobbyists and adversaries would agree. It's fair to say, however, that the issue of the deregulation of natural gas is more complex than Rubik's Cube. It's been made even more confusing by some irresponsible claims about the consequences of removing controls. I want to clear up some of that confusion and in the process explain two things. First, why deregulation is needed, and secondly, why it deserves your support. Your support, even in the face of higher natural gas prices, at least for the short term. The best way to understand today's problem with natural gas is to look at yesterday's problem with oil. Look back at the oil situation for a moment. Most of the energy news during the 1970s was bad. An oil embargo, the cutoff of oil from Iran, and the ever-growing imports of oil at ever higher prices set by the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, that foreign oil cartel known as OPEC. We had, in truth, lost control over our own energy future. To make matters worse, the purveyors of gloom and doom were repeatedly telling us that the U.S. was running out of oil. The only way to handle a growing energy shortage, they kept shouting at us, was to maintain the complex system of federal regulation that had been put in place early in the 70s. That is, turn off the engine, divvy up the shortage among us, rather than to find more or use less. Fortunately for all of us, that point of view did not prevail. All the evidence pointed to controls as the cause of higher prices and periodic shortages, not the cure. So instead of continuing price controls on oil produced in the United States, we decided to give market pricing a chance. The Carter administration began dismantling the cumbersome system of controls in 1979, and the Reagan administration completed the process in January of 1981, removing the remaining price and allocation controls on crude oil and gasoline. Subsequent events have shown the wisdom of those moves. Due primarily to the phase-out of price controls on oil at precisely the right time, that is, when demand was declining and inventories were ample, Americans have stepped up their efforts to conserve, imports have declined, production of oil has increased, and the price of oil and oil products have started on a significant downward slide. However, the battle for energy security is obviously not over, and the OPEC countries know that better than anyone. Sheikh Yamani, Saudi Arabia's oil minister, said recently, "The existing oil surplus in the market doesn't mean the end of the energy problem. This is a transient phase during which many may relax in the sense of false security that it gives, but at the end of which it may cause them a jarring shock. At that point, they will once again look to OPEC for comfort." Now, I don't know about you folks in Cleveland, but I wouldn't want to do anything to give aid and comfort to Sheikh Yamani. We cannot remain highly vulnerable to future supply interruptions that could have devastating effects on our well-being, and we don't have to. We must continue to conserve. We must push ahead with energy development in our own country, taking particular advantage of our abundant natural gas resources. To do so, we must remove the roadblock of federal regulation, and that is going to be no small feat. Government regulations tend to be the nearest thing to eternal life we'll ever see on Earth. Consider, if you will, the various price control schemes that affect natural gas. Gas produced in one state and sold across state lines has been subject to federal price control since 1954. Then in 1978, Congress passed the Natural Gas Policy Act, which some thought would finally remove price controls. Actually, the act does nothing of the sort. It only has made controls more extensive and complicated. Homeowners have thought that they had little reason to care about these complexities. From a homeowner's standpoint, gas is gas. It cooks your eggs in the morning if it comes from a gas well 5,000 feet deep or 20,000 feet deep. Your eggs could care less. But under current regulation, there's a great deal of difference. There are at least 28 separate categories of natural gas, each with a different price ceiling for the people who produce it. These price categories have little to do with economic reality. Instead, they depend on the size of the producing company, whether the gas crosses a state line, when the gas was discovered, and a myriad of other factors. Let me give you an example of reading to you just how one category is defined. Title: new onshore production wells deeper than 5,000 feet. Gas from new wells in an old reservoir within 2.5 miles of an old well provided that new well is outside existing proration unit in parens applied to wells begun to 1977 and thereafter capable of commercial production. And there's 28 of those. Under the Natural Gas Policy Act, controls will be removed from some categories of gas over the next few years, but not from others. In 1985, about 1/2 of all the gas will be decontrolled. The rest will never be decontrolled unless the law is changed. Now, I know that there will undoubtedly be some in this audience who may wish to cheer on those who would not change that law. But let me tell you that the complex system of controls and the contorted plan for continuing them is having a number of alarming effects. Reserves of natural gas, in effect, our nation's storehouse, are dwindling. The total net decrease in proved domestic gas reserves from 1971 through 1979 was almost 96 trillion cubic feet. Gas is being consumed inefficiently, and there are serious distortions in natural gas markets. For some, this may be hard to believe. The natural gas shortages of the 70s seem to have faded into distant memory. There appears to be plenty of gas available, and utilities in some areas are in fact advertising for new business. The fact is that the appearance of plenty is dangerously misleading. In some cases, demand for gas has been held down by legal restrictions. For example, under current law, the Fuel Use Act to be specific, some industrial facilities are flatly prohibited from using natural gas. The Natural Gas Policy Act also discourages other industrial customers from using gas with its incremental pricing rules that charge higher prices for these consumers. Some states have prohibited new residential hookups. And it's hard to believe after having come off of the city streets today, but we've actually had mild winter weather for 2 years in a row. And finally, the recession, of course, importantly, has held down demand. Here is what's really happening, however, under price controls for natural gas. All through the 1960s and the 70s, we found and added to our reserves only about half as much natural gas as we took out. Although the need to add to reserves is great, drilling for gas has increased only an estimated 10% in 1981. By comparison, drilling for oil, which was decontrolled, increased by 36%. Interestingly, in 1977, the year before NGPA was passed, natural gas drilling was up 25% over the prior year. About the only gas free of price controls today is high-risk, high-cost gas that lies below 15,000 feet, so-called deep gas. The Natural Gas Policy Act thus encourages producers to explore for gas more than 3 miles deep and discourages them from searching for gas that's even closer to the surface. This is happening even though the shallower gas reserves are much larger and less costly to produce. In fact, according to a 1981 estimate by the Colorado School of Mines Potential Gas Committee, U.S. natural gas reserves lying above 15,000 feet are about 60% larger than those lying below that depth. By not producing as much of this abundant, shallower gas as we could, we are increasing the probability of future shortages. and we have created a terrible market distortion that Clevelanders served by Columbia Gas are acutely aware of. With gas production lower than it could be, the United States must make up the loss by importing more oil. That, of course, increases our vulnerability to another oil cutoff. Also, we have been importing natural gas from other countries, noticeably Canada and Mexico, at prices higher than we're willing to pay almost all U.S. producers. Once again, consumer pays for these higher costs one way or another. Much of the current debate about what to do about this situation centers around two options. The first might be called the do-nothing option. That means staying with the Natural Gas Policy Act of 1978. The second option is to gradually phase out price controls by 1985, to allow all controlled natural gas prices to rise gradually month by month. It won't come as any surprise to you that I would urge you to consider and support the second option. Phase decontrol is the most practical, reasonable, and equitable way to reach the goal of a totally free and decontrolled market. There will be a number of positive benefits to the nation, to Ohio consumers, from total gradual phase gas deregulation. First, we will reduce our dependence on unstable sources of foreign oil. A number of utilities and industries can use natural gas instead of oil products. By making more natural gas available through greater production and conservation, phase decontrol would mean lower levels of imported oil than under current policy. Indeed, the reduction in demand for imported oil would be significant. The Department of Energy has estimated that compared with existing law, oil and gas imports through 1984 would be lower by the equivalent of 260,000 barrels a day under phase decontrol of natural gas. Another study, this one by Standard of Indiana, estimates energy import savings of 200,000 barrels a day in 1982 and 1 million barrels a day in 1985. The 1985 savings would be equivalent to nearly 1/5 of current oil imports. Second, the U.S. balance of payments would be improved. As we all know, when foreign oil must be purchased, it means that U.S. dollars must leave our country. That obviously weakens the dollar. Phase decontrol will reduce the export of dollars and mean that the dollar would be worth more in terms of yen, mark, pounds, and francs. Third, more consumers would be able to get natural gas. Phase deregulation, as we've noted, would increase exploration and development of new gas. During the 70s, you here in Cleveland will recall most vividly that there were periodic shortages of price-controlled natural gas. With phase deregulation, more businesses and homes, especially new homes, would be able to rely on this clean-burning fuel. Studies project, in fact, an increase of total gas production as a result of total gradual phase decontrol of around 2 trillion cubic feet per year, or the equivalent of 1 million barrels of oil a day by 1985. Fourth, decontrol would also mean lower prices for gasoline and heating oil over the long run. More U.S. natural gas produced and conserved because of a gradual phase deregulation could be substituted for oil imports and thus put even more pressure on the OPEC cartel to hold down crude oil prices. This, over time, would bring billions of dollars in benefits to U.S. consumers of gasoline, heating oil, and other oil products. Fifth, because Americans would be obtaining and using energy resources more efficiently, we would enjoy a healthier and stronger economy. Government studies have shown that with gradual phase decontrol, our economy, as measured by the gross national product, would expand significantly, an increase of $18 billion, according to the Department of Energy, through 1995. Other studies project even larger gains. That, of course, means more job opportunities, more goods, and more services. And finally, decontrol would eliminate the distortions resulting from the price inequities between categories of gas. Are there any drawbacks to the gradual phase decontrol of natural gas? Those who favor the continuation of price controls say yes. They say it would cause prices to skyrocket, factories to shut down, and unemployment to worsen. The facts are that, yes, consumer gas bills will be higher than they are today, but it's important to understand they will also be higher under the present law. How much higher? No one knows for sure, but those who have studied this question are certain that increases from phase decontrol will be nowhere near some of the claims that you may have read or heard. To suggest doubling or tripling of your gas bill is a gross fantasy. Some claims have no basis in any real understanding of how gas prices will be held in check through the laws of supply and demand. Less than half of a consumer's gas bill represents the cost of gas itself. In fact, the average wellhead price in July 1981 was $1.81 per 1,000 cubic feet, compared with the average retail price to the homeowner of $4.58 per 1,000 cubic feet. The other 61% is primarily for transportation and distribution costs through pipelines and utility companies. Phase decontrol applies to the producer of natural gas to the wellhead price. Pipeline and distributor costs should not be affected. Natural gas prices also will be held in check by the price of competing fuels, such as residual fuel oil. That's the view of many economists and analysts. If natural gas continues in plentiful supply as a result of increased exploration, it will simply have to stay competitive in price to sell. One wild statement making the rounds these days is that more than 1 million jobs will be lost because of gradual phase decontrol. Decontrol will not reduce the number of jobs, certainly not over the long term. In fact, it should, as I have said, create opportunities by increasing supplies and increasing economic efficiency. Wouldn't higher gas prices mean higher inflation rates? Two independent Department of Energy studies, one under the Carter administration, one under the Reagan administration, indicate that with phase decontrol, the impact on inflation would be less after 1985 than it will be under the present law. What will consumers get in return for higher gas bills? Based on our experience with the decontrol of oil, those benefits are fairly easy to pinpoint. More abundant supplies of gas and an end to the scattered shortages of the past. Lower overall energy costs. Natural gas prices would be higher, at least for the short term, but supplies would also be greater. And because there would be a greater supply of natural gas, Americans would spend less on other fuels. All in all, we'd be meeting our energy requirements more efficiently and at less total cost. There would also be, at last, an end to some costly government regulation of gas. Interestingly, a government study for fiscal year 1977 estimated the costs of controlling oil associated with regulations at $1 billion. The cost of gas regulation is probably geometrically higher. And finally, more goods and services would be produced because competitive gas pricing will make the economy more efficient. In closing, I'd like to repeat what I said earlier, that the energy outlook is encouraging. We've made excellent progress on the road to energy security. By phasing out price controls on all natural gas, we Americans would be taking a giant stride toward true energy security. And after a decade of discouraging energy news, our goal of reducing dependence upon unstable imported oil would be within reach. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bush. Today at the City Club Forum, we are listening to an address by Nicholas J. Bush on the decontrol of natural gas. In just a moment, we will have our traditional question and answer session, but first, a few announcements. Following this meeting here today, ladies and gentlemen, there will be a meeting of the City Club Forum Foundation, which, as you know, is vitally instrumental in supporting the activities of the club. Many of you have made contributions to this foundation, and they will be having their annual meeting, their regular meeting rather, at the south end of the hall here under the presidency of Peter DeLeon, and I would urge all of those who would care to attend to be present there. Among the matters that will be taken up by the foundation is the election of new trustees. Next Thursday, beginning at 5 p.m. here at the City Club, the New Leaders Group will be sponsoring another evening meeting which all City Club members and their guests are invited to attend. The speaker will be Baseball Commissioner Bowie Kuhn, who some of you may be aware is undergoing some stress these days as to whether or not his job will still be with him next season. That should be really a very interesting session. There will be a buffet dinner at 6 p.m. with a program beginning about 6:45, and if you care to make a reservation, call the City Club here at 621-0082. Today, as always, we have with us students who are participating in our Living Seminars program, which we sponsor in cooperation with the Cleveland Board of Education. With us now are students from the following high schools: Berea, Cleveland Heights, the Cleveland School of Science, East Tech, the Health Career Center, Jane Addams, and South High School. Would you young people please stand and receive our welcome? And of course, as is our custom, these young people will be meeting with Mr. Nicholas J. Bush for a seminar of their own following today's forum. Next Friday, our speaker will be Frederick J. Pizzadaz, who is Executive Director of NOACA, the Northeast Ohio Area-Wide Coordinating Agency, which among other things has a great deal to say and will have a great deal to say about whether or not the proposed dual hub project, which would create a rapid transit corridor between Public Square and University Circle, should ever be built. So I invite all of you again to make reservations in advance for a speech by Fred Pizzadaz, which I'm sure you'll find most illuminating. And now to our traditional question and answer session. Alan Davis is available with a microphone in front of the room. Bob Conrad at the rear. Please raise your hand to be recognized.
Mr. Bush, I read in the paper this morning that there's an oil glut, something everybody seemed to know anyway. And sure enough, when I went to buy gas today, I paid 5 cents less per gallon than I did last time I filled up my tank. This country has, to use your words, abundant natural gas resources. In the event of a natural gas glut, I can understand how competition would cause a reduction in the wellhead price. But what competitive force would compel the gas company to pass that saving onto the consumer?
Well, competition, I would hope, and let me try to expand on that a bit. The generally regarded as the marginal unit upon which gas competes in this country, 30% of all natural gas is used for industrial use. That's what most economists would recognize as the marginal unit, the price determinant unit. And a great deal of that gas is centered in the Gulf Coast market under boilers. That gas is sold to customers who have the ability to go back and forth between oil and gas depending upon the price that they have offered to them. The experience in the intrastate market prior to 1978, where those prices were decontrolled, was that gas never exceeded the price of number 6 residual fuel oil, which is used under those boilers. So the competitive forces of one producing a lot of gas and having to sell it, basically in order, it's not any different than it is with any other commodity. If you have a whole surplus of things to sell, the only way you're going to stay in business is to continue to sell them. And if you have a lot of competition with a lot of people producing the same sort of a commodity that you do, and a lot of people competing in order to obtain that commodity, pipelines and utilities, which are highly competitive and would compete in that kind of a marketplace, there's going to be a domino effect of passing through to the consumer as prices go down. It really isn't that complicated, I don't believe. There are other complicating factors in it, and I don't want to be simplistic about this. There are contract considerations, and there are other regulatory considerations. There's the Public Utility Commission, which oversees the utility's ability to charge its price. There's the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which oversees a pipeline's ability to charge a certain price. I don't want to be overly simplistic, but on the other hand, the fact is that the experience with oil is absolutely, I am convinced, indicative of the same experience that will result with any commodity. You produce more of it, the demand at a higher price begins to fall, the producer begins to cut his price because he has to sell it. And the oil situation right now is at a real turning point in the world. The OPEC nations are facing a serious long-term challenge to their viability. This cartel exists only on the ability to place over the market a major disruption. It's going to, our resolve, our decision-making as a nation right now to put aside our own self-interest, parochial or regional or personal, in order to address this problem, I'm convinced, is going to determine whether or not we are held hostage to Middle Eastern oil and whether we're held hostage to paying out of our bank account for people like Gaddafi and those kinds of Middle East nations, or whether they're going to seize this opportunity for ourselves and supply ourselves with our own abundant resources. The choice is ours. We can either go back and feel much more comfortable with the price controls that are supposedly to protect us as consumers because they control the price at a very low level, and lead ourselves right into the same shortages that shut down schools and hospitals and businesses here in 1977, or we can take this opportunity to put order in our house and bring market pricing into the energy world and take away the reins of control that I feel have been put in the hands of those people for too long.
Mr. Bush, you speak as though there is no alternative to this dilemma. But my question is, when is the United States going to get in step with the rest of the world and nationalize life-sustaining energy?
Nationalize, you mean nationalize the companies, nationalize energy companies? Well, pray tell, not in my lifetime. I guess that's a philosophical question. There are people who simply believe that a socialized approach to government and to business, Britain has been down that road. It's true that there are other countries that do nationalize energy companies. They nationalize their resources. I am a firm believer in less government and in more control of the private sector, personally and in the hands of businesses. I had a luncheon yesterday, if you bear with me for a moment, with a very good friend of mine in Washington who's a very liberal economist, extremely liberal, well known. You'd recognize his name. And we were discussing at lunch this very thing, and he was telling me about how government's not doing its job. It's not fixing potholes. It's not providing quality education. It's not doing those things. And I said, well, wait a minute. Now, which government are you talking about? He said, well, the government in Washington. I said, well, Paul, why? Tell me, why should the government in Washington fix the potholes in Cleveland? The mayor of Cleveland's responsible for doing that, is he not? He's responsive there. I hope there's no one here in this audience who believes that some bureaucrat in Washington, and I'm not running for office, but I'm telling you, I'm responsive to my experience in the past 6 years in Washington. There is, I'll assure you, no bureaucracy which sitting in Washington can determine what energy you need, at what price you should pay, and who should supply it to you. It's you're competing against the folks over here, competing against the folks over here, competing against whoever may want to supply it to you in whatever form that will keep your price the very lowest. I believe that very much.
I think you're running for office here. Mr. Bush, one thing you didn't touch on is the growing problem between the energy producers and the environmentalists. And having someone like Jane Watt as Secretary of the Interior is like having Adolf Hitler cater a bar mitzvah. I think what we need, sir, is once again to go back to the American development of choice by consensus. Going back to Morton and Hickel, we had a long parade of Secretaries of the Interior who are willing to listen to both sides. This man has polarized it. I think he's hurt your cause. He's hurt the cause of the environmentalists. He was quoted recently saying there are Americans and there are liberals. Would you comment?
I like Jim Watt. Let me just tell you that the Audubon Society, the Environmental Policy Center, some of the most devoted people who are in favor of decontrol of natural gas are the environmentalists. They recognize that increased supplies of natural gas provide a clean burning fuel as an alternative to coal burning and some of those problems. Let me just make that point. As environmentalists, and that's what I meant by some of our traditional adversaries in the natural gas debate, are very much behind us in this argument. Now as to Jim Watt, I'm not here to defend Secretary Watt. He is a highly controversial figure who has proved to be a lightning rod for the Reagan administration in terms of dealing with people. He has advocated positions and policies which I don't want to say that he's been misinterpreted. I'm getting myself into the wrong position here, defending the Secretary of the Interior. Let me just tell you that based on my knowledge of the man, he is not out to rape America's lands and turn and do away with snowy owls in Alaskan fields and do great harm, irreversible harm to the environment. He really doesn't believe that. He does quarrel with the fact that others would set aside millions of acres, hundreds of millions of acres, as they have in Alaska, into wilderness where no motorized vehicle can travel, where no human development other than walking, and that may be a justifiable use of that land that people as a consensus support. But those are policy questions that are debated out and should be debated out and have been debated out. I like Cecil Andrus as well as an individual. I thought he was misunderstood by an awful lot of people in business. He had a true concern for the environment and tried to implement good, conservative natural resource policies as well. Just don't let environmentalists trying to raise money in order and portraying Jim Watt, necessarily, jade your thinking on the man. I'd invite you to have Secretary Watt or his Undersecretary Bill Horn here to the Cleveland City Club to explain to you what they really stand for, instead of reading in the paper what you think they stand for.
My name is Ted Dostal. I'm active in the Senior Citizens Coalition here in Cleveland. Now, you put up a very good defense of Reagan economics, and we have our opinions of it too. We see its consequences and how it devastates huge masses of people. But I would like to ask you, when you reveal all these things about shortages, why don't you talk about the surpluses of profits that the energy industry is making, the one industry that makes more profits than any other company in the world, any other companies? How come you don't talk about the billions that Exxon made? Why don't you talk about those things and say that that results in the lowering standard of living of a huge mass of people in this country? Why don't you? No, you are on the other side.
Do you have another question, Mr. Dostal? Is that it? Yeah.
The bankers today are charging 16 or 17 or 20% interest on all investments, and they're the ones that control Exxon and all the energy industry that you're talking about. How come they have to get 17, 18% interest on the money they loan to Exxon, Chase Manhattan Bank and Morgan Guarantee Trust and so forth? Why don't you talk about that kind of politics or that kind of economics? To talk about the real people that are making the profits. I asked him, why doesn't he talk about them?
Mr. Dostal, my parents are here in the audience, and they're both over 70. I would no more advocate policies that are not in their interest or advocate feelings that would harm them than I would sit here and tell you that I would try to harm you. I am absolutely and totally sensitive to the problems that are caused by higher energy prices upon poor people and upon senior citizens. But I would suggest to you, sir, that you address your questions to Senator Metzenbaum and Senator Glenn, because the government policy and the government handling of those questions of policy are properly the judgment of government. If there are economic dislocations in our society, then it's government's job to address themselves to those. Now, you asked me another question about the outrageous profits of oil companies. Well, if you've noticed recently, those outrageous oil company profits have been falling somewhat. And the prospects are that they are not going, no, sir, they're not going up right now. They're going down. And I hate to tell you, well, you may be pleased, but I hate to think about it. They're going to be going down considerably, both because of an excise tax that has been put on the normal 67% tax. I'm not, profits, sir, are savings. They're to be regenerative in a private sector economy, and they're to provide jobs and benefits. And they are not squandered away in the basement of Exxon's headquarters where someone can roll around in them and enjoy themselves like some Scrooge character out of Donald Duck. They're put to work to build things. I know I'm not convincing you, Mr. Dossel, and I truly am just trying to be responsive and sensitive to your concerns. And I really would like you to sit down, and you probably have, written your letter to Senator Metzenbaum and Senator Glenn and your congressman, and let them know that you feel that the government should be addressing some of the problems that senior citizens have in adjusting themselves to energy prices.
I'd like to know whether Mexico supplies U.S. with natural gas.
Yes, sir. At a cost of $5 a 1,000 cubic feet, about 2.5 times what you're paying a domestic producer. And you're not taxing it. So it's an economic windfall, a rent.
Mr. Bush, it seems to me that what you're suggesting is that there are public benefits from the decontrol of natural gas, mostly from the reduction of our dependence on imported foreign oil. But there are really no private benefits for the consumers of the gas who are going to have to pay higher prices. Doesn't this put the burden disproportionately on poor and middle-income people, and disproportionately in the cities of the Great Lakes states where we're dependent on gas consumption and where we're already suffering from Reagan's economic policies?
It's a good question. Very, very thoughtful and a good question. Let me try to answer it. If you can, and please bear with me a while because I'm going to try to make this as simple as possible, but still be responsive to where the consumer benefits from gradual decontrol of natural gas. In the 1970s, 77, the intrastate market, basically gas produced in and sold in Texas and Louisiana, Oklahoma, those types of markets, moved, transported, sold, and used in those states, was decontrolled and free of prices, free of price controls. As a result of that, natural gas was drawn into those states or kept in those states because you were able to get the price that you could sell it for. Now that caused in 1977 a tremendous problem when there was a severe winter with states, and Ohio was one of the worst, and Columbia Gas had one of the worst problems because of their long-term commitments and their inability to supply enough gas. It was being used and consumed in intrastate markets. That brought about, I don't know what the economic devastation was to poor and senior citizens when you don't have gas. I don't know how you measure that. I would certainly say that the effects would be outrageous. The Natural Gas Policy Act reversed that to a certain degree. It placed controls on the intrastate market, and as a result now we have this market distortion. We have pipelines that have access through their contract commitments to a great amount of gas at low prices, 50 cents, 26 cents an MCF. As a result of that, other pipelines don't have as much access to that, are buying new gas at higher prices. This convoluted system is right now causing all kinds of distortions. You have pipelines that are able right now that are contracting for gas at $9 a 1,000 cubic feet, rolling that into their pipeline prices, their commitments of old gas of 26 and 50, and averaging out to produce a price that is fairly near what they would consider market clearing. Now let me tell you where the hang-up is with that. In 1985 under NGPA, when this new gas is decontrolled, you folks sitting in this audience are going to find that a number of the contracts that are carrying triggering clauses for Ohio pipelines may fly up. And they may fly up considerably more than they would if you had an overall reduction in the price of natural gas. You're going to have them triggering off of that $9. I'm trying to stay out of the cliches of the natural gas business in terms of talking, and I'm using words like trigger and that sort of thing, and you have to understand a little bit about the contract situation. But let me just assure you that just follow your net instincts on this, if you would. It is not altogether different than what has happened with gasoline and oil. You compete, you put a commodity out there, and you make it compete and make it hold its own against alternative energy supplies or against its own commodity being produced by a whole lot of people. There are so many oil and gas producers in this country, no one knows for sure how many there are. The last count was 19,300 oil and gas producers. Now, I'm telling you, that kind of competition with the hundreds and thousands of pipelines and distributors is going to create a dynamic situation which, even though I can't cite the economic study, I can't tell you about, I guess I could come here and quote to you eminent economists, but I'm just telling you to follow what you see and physically feel and hear and watch what's happening with oil. The price will go down. It's a fact. It will go down under a competitive system, and it will benefit in the long run people in Cleveland and middle western states who eventually would have to deal with the possibility of shortages.
Mr. Bush, advocates of a free economy are also concerned about constraints on the supply side. So would you give us some indication if there are any dominant figures in the natural gas supply system and what percentage of the production they control in their own name or controlled corporations? The second part of the question is, you've alluded to competitive factors, but what would prevent gas suppliers from lowering the price to large commercial users and increasing the price to domestic users if there were no controls?
Could you restate the last half of that question? What would prevent them from
reducing the price to large commercial industrial users and increasing the price to residential users?
Okay. Well, prices to residential users are not set by producers. They're set by distributors and by pipelines. You have to work your way back. You don't buy from ExxonMobil or Nick Wheelis Oil. You buy from a distributor. Those distributors' prices are monitored extremely closely by public utility commissions. Back down the slot, you go to pipelines. Those are supposedly very closely watched by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So you get back down the chain to the producer. There are some producers who do make direct sales to industrial users. But by and large, it's not the case. Most sell to pipelines directly or to distributing companies. So I'd fall back to my other argument. The distributor who supplies primarily a residential user will just go someplace else to find the gas. I mean, if you walk in to me and you say, look, I have to supply 55,000 homes in the Northeast and I'll pay you, or we negotiate the price, then, and I say to you I want $2 more than you're willing to pay, you'll go and find someone else, if you're able to. Now, your ability to be able to find someone else to buy that gas from, I would contend, is based upon the number of people out there competing and have a lot of incentive to find gas to supply you. Now, I would say to you that the more people out there competing to find gas and bring it to market, so to sell it to you, would increase your chances of lowering your price. Now, to address your other point, who controls natural gas? I read with interest a story there was originally a story in the Plain Dealer by an op-ed piece, I believe, by Mike Butler, chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, called a primer in natural gas deregulation, and then it was followed by a story done by Bill Callahan, who I believe heads up a group called OPEC here in Ohio, and he cited that, and he said that 20 companies control 50% of all the natural gas reserves in this country, production. Well, he's right. And the largest one controls 8% of all the natural gas reserves. One company controls 8%. 20 control 50%. Now, he was using that to say there was concentration. There isn't an economist in this country who would tell you that if 50% of a commodity is held and controlled by 20 different companies, there is even the chance that monopoly power could exist. I mean, normal, traditional Department of Justice monopoly standards say that if you have 4 companies or 8 companies concentrated with 70%, then you've got a real chance of monopoly power. Now, there simply isn't that kind of concentration in the oil and gas business, and you know, we can continue to believe that there are the gnomes of Houston or the gnomes of Munich or the gnomes of London who meet in their back halls who want to do us in. But I'll tell you, it just isn't true. There's companies out there competing very hard to find reserves so they can sell it and earn money. And the more of them doing it, the less chance they have of earning too much. An anomaly, interestingly enough, among the producing community is this creation of deep gas. You know, the $9, the guy, I have a few constituents who are drilling for deep gas below 15,000 feet. And they're able, because of this distorted market we have, to sell it for $9 a 1,000 cubic feet, when realistically the market clearing price is generally considered to be around $4.50 right now. Now, the coalition against decontrol includes some producers who don't want to see an end to that. And if we're silly enough to let them do it, then we will.
Mr. Bush, you have extolled the virtues of competition and indicated that we'll get lots of supplies by virtue of decontrol. And you point to the experience in the oil industry saying that decontrol has brought about great increases in supplies. There are those who would say that a very substantial contributing factor to the present oversupply of oil is conservation. For example, cars that now get 30 miles to a gallon instead of 12 miles to a gallon. My question is, what action, if any, is your organization taking to promote conservation methods in the use of natural gas? For example, installation of pilotless gas ranges throughout the country. A second question, if I may. You invited our attention to the experience we have had with oil. Many of us remember representatives of the oil industry coming around a few years ago and extolling the virtues of decontrol, and that was going to produce all kinds of money by which the oil industry could go out and use to find new supplies. We do remember what the oil companies have done, Ohio buying Kennecott, Mobil buying Montgomery Ward, Standard of Jersey buying, or pardon me, Exxon buying Reliance. Why should we listen to you based on the experience we've had with them?
I'm a nice guy. I would hope, I would like to think that might be one reason. No. The acquisitions you're talking about, and I have to quickly, I'm not going to dodge the question. I'm going to try to explain it, but let you understand that I'm not here to represent any company. Exxon can speak for its acquisition of Reliance, Ohio for Kennecott, and likewise. It is of interest that the figures, and I was trying to look through and see, I had made notations on this, kind of anticipating that question might arise. I had made a notation, and I believe that the figures are, and I please bear with me for accuracy, and I would like to give you accurate figures on this. I'm going to give you a range of dimension figures. The oil industry, those acquisitions that you mentioned represent, I believe, about 2% of the source of funds available to the oil industry, those companies' acquisitions. Now, that's partially because you're dealing in just absolutely astronomical investment numbers for oil and gas. The oil industry is projected from 1975 through 85 will have to spend $38 billion alone on just enhanced recovery techniques on old wells to increase production, keep away from abandonment of some old wells that need kinds of those work. To build a drilling platform in the Beaufort Sea in Alaska costs $100 million, one platform. Each well costs $2.5 million to drill, that kind of a magnitude. The most visible, and please don't, what I'm not trying to do is defend society's right to question corporate practices. You have every reason to raise questions about whether or not those acquisitions are in society's interest, and people ought to be questioning. But let me just tell you that 95% and better of the money that the oil industry receives stays in energy resource development. You don't hear about it too much because it doesn't make a flashy headline to say that Sohio or Exxon or Mobil just went out and lost $1 billion in dry holes looking for oil in the Destin Dome. It just doesn't carry the same pizzazz as saying Kennecott's going down to big oil. It's just a dimension factor.
I've heard it said that we might have a good chance of balancing the budget if we put a windfall profits tax on, coupled with deregulation of natural gas. Would your association willing to accept a windfall profit tax coupled with deregulation?
No. Excise taxes, windfall profits taxes either have two effects. We can, the government may very well decide to do otherwise, but the windfall profits tax have two effects. Either it's a cost of doing business, and either the company, if possible, passes it through, and it raises your prices even more. You may get it on the other end, you may not, but it'll be siphoned through any number of government bureaucracies, and you'll lose a little going from one end to the other. So you may get some of it back if the company can pass it through. If it can't pass it through, if a tax cannot be passed through, then it suppresses the incentive to drill for some more reserves, to go find more, and you don't get any of the benefits you paid for. You were supposed to be getting benefits from decontrol. That is more of it, less risk for less chance that shortages will occur. Why would you want to deprive yourself on betting on the come that somebody in Washington may redirect some of that money, back here to your benefit? I would oppose it. I would ask you to join me in that opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Bush. The City Club forum is adjourned.